women in film. And I've been reading this book called Backwards and in Heels by Alicia Malone, who's a film critic. I knew her as a YouTube personality. I watched a lot of her sort of film critiques and different things she would do on YouTube. But then she wrote this book, and it kind of is a chronological look at women in film over time. And the first line of the book stuck out to me, and I've always remembered it. And when whatever Wendy just said sparked it again, where I'm going to read this first line. What if I told you that in the 1900s through the early 1920s, there were more female filmmakers actively working at the top of Hollywood than there are today? Many of which had their own production companies, and the first ever person to be credited film editor was a woman.
That was a snippet of my conversation this week with Mike Sheppard, who's the host of a new show on CFRC in Kingston, Ontario, called Screening in Kingston. It's a weekly show about the movies and the movie industry, and my other guest was Wendy Huot, who's the owner of the Screening Room, the local downtown cinema in Kingston, Ontario. My name is Ben Charland. This is What on Earth is Going On, your weekly podcast for a world in flux. This week's conversation is interesting to me for a multitude of reasons. First of all, it's a three-way conversation. First time I've done that on this show, and I found it really, really interesting to have all of these voices engaging in a different way than I'm used to, which is a duologue. The second thing I wanted to mention was, although we're looking at film, it's so easy to find all of the different connections to all of the different things that we talk about on this show. Film is inherently political and cultural. It represents the conversations that we're already having. All you have to do is watch a movie to see what our culture is saying about itself, or see what another culture is saying about itself, or a subculture, or so on. It's a fascinating art form because it's both incisive, but it's also immensely popular. But it's changing. Streaming services that you can get on your computer or on your mobile device are besieging the traditional film industry. There are other changes as well. Just the access to information that people have, the attention spans that are changing both for kids and for adults, the way that we process and receive both information and story, the way that we tell stories. All of this is changing, and it's really difficult to arrest just what on earth is going on in film. But if we talk about the culture and we talk about the effects that film has, then we have, I think, a really strong starting point. Anyways, there's a lot more to be had in this conversation, and I'll let you make up your own mind. But before we get there, I wanted to, as always, ask you a favor. If you have any feedback or suggestions for the show, please reach out. The website is www.wogoshow.com. That's WOEGO show.com. You can find all previous episodes and future episodes at that website for free. And if you have any suggestions or feedback or questions about the show, you can just email me, and I'll give you the email address right now. It's wogoshow@gmail.com. That's WOEGO show@gmail.com. Now, on to the conversation. Okay, Wendy Huot and Mike Sheppard, welcome to the show.
Hi, Ben. It's good to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming. This is exciting. This is a three-way conversation.
Mm-hmm.
We don't do that too often on this show, so I'm really excited to have this kind of conversation. Today we're going to talk about film and what on earth is going on in film, the developments in the news in film, and how the culture of film as an art form is changing, also as a form of entertainment. Mm-hmm. And those two things can sometimes be the same thing. Those two things can also sometimes be distinct.
Absolutely.
And so it's really important for us to really get to the bottom of the basics of what film is as an industry and as an art form. And then we can talk about other things as well. But before we get all down that line, I've got my first question, which is always the same. And Mike, I'm going to ask you first.
Okay.
Mike Sheppard, what on earth is going on?
Thanks for asking. That's a great question. So I think to answer that, I kind of want to begin by saying that I think we're starting to see the end, or I won't say end. I'll correct myself. The sort of fallout or final steps of a very important movement that was happening in film, the Me Too movement. And now we're seeing a crossroad where one of two things is going to happen. It's going to go in a very positive way that's going to change things in the film industry, or it's going to go in a very negative way where the public will take it over and it will basically become everyone on Twitter and YouTube are judge, jury, and executioner. So for me, that's kind of where I look at what on earth is going on in film, especially over, I'd say at least the past year, but I think it's also been building for years before that, that there was a positive moment of change that came out of a horrible, really a horrible act and a horrible thing around the Harvey Weinstein accusations. And I think that a lot of really amazing things happened and showed the power and strength of social media and the power and strength of the film industry, but also has started to show its weaknesses and its issues and its struggles. So I actually think right now we're at an interesting crossroad where we could go and continue on a positive route, or we could backtrack even worse than we were before, which I'm seeing examples of both come up. So that's kind of my answer to that question.
It's interesting because you identify the Me Too movement, and it's difficult to ascertain whether that's a symptom or a cause of what on earth is going on in film. And if it is just a symptom, what are the deeper forces at play? And I think you mentioned one, which is social media and the fragmentation of audiences, the fragmentation of opinions. I'm really interested in the future of streaming services. I mean, not just Netflix, but Apple, Hulu, Disney is going to start a streaming service where they put all of their content onto one platform. All of these guys are finally recognizing what Netflix knew some years ago is that this is the future of entertainment. Of course, you also have, and Wendy, we're going to get to you in a second, but Wendy, you're the owner of a business here in Kingston, the Screening Room. You have a cinema, and that's a whole other way for people. It's an older way, and I think a better way to experience film as a community. But it's also under some kind of threat by streaming services. But then again, people have been saying that film is under threat for a very long time.
Yes.
And as you can tell when you look at the Screening Room, it's actually really, really successful with the renovations you guys have done recently. But I just wanted to get, just to echo what you said, Mike, and talk about the deeper forces at play too. And I think that the fragmentation of audiences is critical too. But not to let that taint your answer, Wendy, because you can answer this question however you like. Wendy, what on earth is going on?
Yeah, there's definitely some very interesting things going on in the film industry and in film exhibition. I guess to sort of elaborate a little bit on what Mike just said, there is, I'm very focused on like the exhibition side, sort of the presenting of movies, people watching movies and appreciating movies. Film, the production side, like the whole business of making movies, it's a whole other world. And it's something that I get to observe from an interesting position, but it's still, just like mostly everyone else, I still play this sort of observer role when it comes to the business of movie making. And, it's interesting, the Me Too movement. It's something that, I've been following pretty closely with, great interest since things really erupted last fall. And there's a lot of really kind of ugly stuff that's come out of it. But I'm curious to see, like, in just a very practical way, how it will affect, which types of movies get made. I mean, you can definitely see that there's a lot of interest in sort of supporting female filmmakers and having more sort of female crew members. And, of course, I get a little bit anxious whenever, you start worrying about kind of tokenism and kind of quotas and that kind of thing. But I can say from, the film movie watching and the, cinema film going side that, the slight majority of tickets sold in North America are sold to female moviegoers. That's an even greater proportion when it comes to the kind of specialty art house, sort of smaller scale films that we play in the Screening Room. Our audience is definitely noticeably predominantly, majority female. Movies that have female protagonists and often female filmmakers, telling the stories tend to do quite well at the Screening Room, disproportionately well. Yeah. So I'm excited to see more sort of female-led film productions coming down the pipeline. There has, I think, for a while. It's funny, this wasn't really so much the case like back in like the 10s and 20s and 30s when there is no shortage of great female leads, including even sometimes women who are into some interesting. You had a lot of power in Hollywood, but in the last few decades, I think there's been it's mostly men, kind of making movies, and the sort of presumption that, that you're primarily kind of that, women will watch men's movies, men won't watch women's movies.
Yeah.
So, but yes, that's starting to change. So I'm interested in which types of films are going to be made, and which films will get like a real kind of push and have a lot of money kind of put behind them. I mean, obviously, with Wonder Woman and Black Panther, both those films have really kind of changed a lot of assumptions about which movie, what types of movies can become huge hits. Yeah.
Wendy, I'm really fascinated by what you said about you being a person on the film exhibition side. It's interesting to me, and Mike just pulled out a book, so I hope I'm not interrupting your thought process.
No, you're
but
not
keep
at all.
keep your finger on
Yes,
it.
I'm ready to go.
But it's interesting because I think Mike and I both actually come from a theater background. We don't know each other that well, but we both know that we have this background in theater where the performance and the show is so important. And one thing a lot of theater people think about film is that film lacks that transitory live nature. But we all will disagree with that when we're in a cinema. We know that film is live because the thing on the screen might not change, but the audience does.
Yeah.
A perfect example of that is the film The Room, where
Yeah.
people go to see this, and many people have seen this 100 times, and it's one of the worst movies ever made. And it plays at the screening room sometimes, and people go and they throw spoons at the screen. Why would you go more than once to the same thing, unless the experience itself changes every time?
Yeah.
And so my question for you, Wendy, is do you think in the years that you've been working at the screening room and running it, have you seen a change in the way that people watch movies and interact with movies, or is it pretty much a constant in your experience?
That's a good question. I mean, so I've been running the screening room for 7 years now. And when I first took over the theater too, we were still playing all of our movies on, celluloid film,
Right.
35 millimeter celluloid, converted to digital a few years after, about 2013, 2014. But yeah, in terms of how people watch movies, I mean, basically the kind of basic social norms of how an audience conducts itself are more or less the same. Most people are quiet. Sometimes there's a bit of chatting. You can hear other people eating popcorn. Maybe when it comes to what people laugh at, I think humor is something that really evolves. So I could imagine a movie made, 7 years ago. What people might really laugh at now might be different than even just 7 years ago. Basic kind of movie-going etiquette is the same. In terms of, well, it's funny though, you do mention The Room though, and that's a film that is, whenever we play it, the mood in the audience is a bit different every time. There's been times where I've kind of sat in on a screening and there's been a really kind of aggressive, weird, slightly menacing tone in the audience where people are really shouting out stuff. Some of it's pretty offensive, and it's just kind of like, it's kind of aggro. People are just seem like kind of, drunk and excited at the idea that you can just shout things during a movie. And then there's other times where the audience has this more kind of geeky, appreciative, like who can make the most sort of clever, weird joke. So sometimes there's that vibe, which is very different. The Room, it is, that is an example of a movie that's different every time you see it. And it is, as a more recent kind of cult audience participation movie, it is something that it is starting to become a little bit more codified. Like when we first started playing the film, maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, there wasn't, other than throwing spoons, there weren't a whole lot of ritualistic things that everybody knew to do at the same time. And I'd say when we play it now, there are things that are a bit more ritualized, things that people consistently kind of shout out. And the Rocky Horror Picture Show, we play that every, in the days leading up to Halloween. It's funny, that film's been around for 40 years. So that's one where people often, I think a lot of people who come, they've done a little bit of Google searching and they've read the scripts of what to bring and what to say and what to throw, and it's become very ritualized. And maybe if it's your first time going, it will feel like chaos. But as somebody who's been, hosted dozens of screenings of the Rocky Horror Picture Show over the years, it's starting to develop a bit of a kind of sameness. But the Room still doesn't quite have that sameness.
I'm going to put my finger on a thought before I get to Mike, which is social media. And I know that a lot of big movie companies, cinemas, are trying to figure out how to allow tweeting or social media participation during the screening of a film, because they know that that's one way to keep that interaction going and make people want to go to the cinema. And I want to get your reaction to that. But before we do, Mike, I wanted to get to you. And where was your finger pointed on that book?
Well, Wendy brought up a really interesting point about women in film. And I've been reading this book called Backwards and in Heels by Alicia Malone, who's a film critic. I knew her as a YouTube personality. I watched a lot of her sort of film critiques and different things she would do on YouTube, but then she wrote this book, and it kind of is a chronological look at women in film over time, and the first line of the book stuck out to me, and I've always remembered it. And when whatever Wendy just said sparked it again, where I'm going to read this first line. What if I told you that in the 1900s through the early 1920s, there were more female filmmakers actively working at the top of Hollywood than there are today? Many of which had their own production companies, and the first ever person to be credited film editor was a woman. So something changed after that point. The early part of film, and this book's amazing because it goes through some of these women and how they've been lost through history, but the early part of film seems to be at least more equal than it is now. And I think that that's a very interesting point and thought of what has changed since 1920 that actually regressed. And as Wendy kind of pointed out, that more men will not watch films or creations by women, but women will watch films created or starring men. So I think it's kind of an interesting change, and that's always stuck in me because when I first read that line, I was shocked. I would have thought that only recently women have started to go into film in a strong way, but it's since the 1900s. Like the first story in here is about someone who I believe, was around in the late 1800s and was there when film was first created and started to produce and direct films. So I thought that was a very interesting point and wanted to kind of bring that up because I know I didn't know that. I don't know if either of you knew that, but I didn't know that.
But it struck a parallel to me because if you, and this might be one of the tangent that we before we started recording, we talked about tangents and the tangents that we might go on. So forgive me, I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent to tell you about this parallel that I have in mind, which is when Shakespeare wrote the play Othello, the Moor of Venice, which is about a black North African general in white Italian city Venice. It was obviously a play about difference and about black and white and about two different nations, cultures, or peoples intermingling. But it's difficult to find the same undertones of racism in that play that you would find in the 19th and 20th centuries. And what that a lot of scholars have said is that racism, as we know of it today, and is hopefully on the way out the door, or we thought was maybe on the way out the door, that racism was a systematic creation of 18th and 19th century, specifically slave owners, who wanted to justify intellectually the practice of owning slaves and profiting from the ownership of people. And what it means is that it kind of breaks the notion that, well, in history, people were racist and we're less racist now. It's actually, racism was a blip of history. And in a way, you could look at sexism in the same way. And it sounds to me like you could look at women in the film industry and maybe all of the arts in the same way. That the creation of this idea that the man directs the film and the man writes the film and the woman comes in as the starlet that we all think is pretty, that's actually a creation of 20th century Hollywood. And that to me is really important to know, because otherwise we create this other understanding that we're on this single track of progress, whatever that might be. Wendy, I mean, when it comes to the Me Too movement, when it comes to this recognition of the role that women play in film, again, going back to your 7 years at the screening room, but your lifetime of looking at movies, have you seen the seeds of this change coming, or is this quite sudden and unexpected?
I'd say it does. Well, I guess it does seem sudden. I guess it would be interesting if I actually, was working in the film industry and film production and was familiar with the, insane power dynamics you have in an industry where it's this winner take all thing and you have, thousands and thousands of people competing for just like a handful of spot. It's, it's a very different working culture and industry than anything that I've ever seen. And it does seem like as you kind of hear stories, you get more of a, people sharing their stories. It's like, oh, it seemed like there was some kind of, reckoning that was, that was due. And from the outside, though, it is, I don't know. It is one thing I could say. I mean, it's just in terms of, say, the movies being made, types of stories being made. I mean, I could see from, looking at the data, like our actual box office data, that, again, stories about women perform disproportionately well. Particularly, it's often like when the Oscars would roll around, I'd kind of look at the movies that did the best for us at, in terms of our box office performance. And often they had female protagonists, often older female protagonists. And then when like the Oscar, when, you have this crop of kind of American prestige movies coming out that are kind of chasing, Oscar nominations, all of a sudden the movies are much more kind of male focused and male story focused. I remember a few years ago, maybe it was just 3 years ago, looking at the list of, the 9 Best Picture nominees. And I think only one of them had a female protagonist, and then there is, it's the year of the theory of everything. There was another movie which had like a female co-star,
right.
And the rest of the movies were all male protagonists, and half of them were about, crazy, difficult male geniuses, and people putting up with them to various degrees. And I could say like, wow, there's a huge disconnect between people's idea of what constitutes sort of like a prestige movie, kind of an Oscar-worthy movie, and those movies that get that kind of attention, and then the movies that people are actually coming to see. And I could tell like there's a disconnect, just like on the data and money. Like there's more money to be made if people would make movies that were more representative of the movie-going audience. So I mean, on that level, I felt like, okay, there's going to be some kind of reckoning.
And that's funny because if you look at what's happened, Wendy already brought it up. Wonder Woman and like last year and Black Panther this year were huge box office numbers, and those were two things that I had always heard, and I didn't hear much. Same as Wendy, like I'm more of a film fan, been on a couple film sets, mainly amateur. I know a few people in the industry, so we talk, but the attitude was always, if you have a male lead that's not white or a female lead, your movie isn't going to sell. And that's complete, like you can't look at those two movies and say both have those things and completely did extremely well, like outperformed other movies. Black Panther outperformed the Avengers movie that came out the same year. I mean, that's both domestically and worldwide. So, I mean, that's shown a bit of a shift and build of that.
And it's funny, not that long ago, I thought, I was like, let's look at what the best-selling, the top box office, 10 top grossing films were in the 1920s and 1930s. So I just pulled up a few Wikipedia articles to get top grossing films. And I'd say, if you look at who's starring in the film, I would say, most years, 5 out of 10, 6 out of 10 of the top grossing films had female protagonists. Just look at the film Queen Christina starring Greta Garbo, which I think in 1933 was the top grossing film of the year. It's about, Greta Garbo is the single woman. She's the Queen of Sweden, and she wears like men's clothing, and she's just sleeping with men and just having these incredible romances, and just completely dominating her world. And it's this movie, if you were to watch, like if this movie came out now, people would be like, this is revolutionary. Whereas at the time, it's just like, it wasn't even a revolutionary movie at the time. This is just like, this is the kind of movie that people want to see, movie about like this really strong, maybe even ball-breaking, intriguing woman. It was it was just sort of taken for granted that was the kind of movie that people wanted to see in droves.
And it's interesting because, again, I'm not being paid to talk about this book that I love so much, Backwards and in Heels, by Alicia Malone. But again, some of the stories of early films. There were films that were directed by women before the 1920s that were about abortion, that were about women's rights, that were about sexuality, which is another thing that, talking about how there's a very interesting YouTube series that goes through and talks about the differences in the casting room for men and women and everything, and how every female character for a long period of time was just like the male's love interest. But in the early 1920s, it's like, well, here's a woman who embraces her sexuality, does whatever she wants. And again, like same as Wendy's saying, it would be revolutionary now, but was being done when talkies were new, where they were still called talkies because there was silent films and then there was talkies. So in kind of the early stages of film, there were topics being discussed and shown on film that would cause riots today. And when I say riots, I mean like a couple hashtags on YouTube, or Twitter and YouTube and all those things. But still, there would be backlash to that type of thing. Yet back then, it was kind of like, this is what people want to see. They come to see it. They want to see the interaction of film. Like that's the power of art, and we've already kind of talked about it. And Ben, going back to theater is another thing, is art is best when there's a reaction between the art you create and express and the audience reaction. So seeing the reaction is part of that, and maybe not liking it or discussing it is supposed to be part of that, but there's somewhere along the line there was a shift where if you don't agree with my opinion, we're now enemies, as opposed to if you don't agree with my opinion, we can discuss it and that's great and walk out of here and be fine. So there is a shift somewhere in that where I think it causes more controversies than obviously there used to be, because all of these films came out years ago.
Yeah, and Wendy, I'm reminded actually of what you said a few moments ago about Rocky Horror Picture Show and how the audiences probably when that first came out, they were just starting to figure out what this could mean and experimenting. And if it's your first time going to it, you experience the chaos and the craziness of being at this movie. But it's become hardened and ritualized, and now we know what it is. And frankly, the room is too. People bring spoons, people shout certain things at different moments, and there's a ritual, and it's hardened into expectations. When we talk about film in the early days, when it was just becoming talkies, from what I understand, film was a very highly politicized art form because people recognized in this political sphere that you could use this art form to mobilize people very, very easily. You could communicate and tell a story to them that could win them over to your side. Propaganda was very easily understood through the lens of film. But obviously, from a commercial aspect, things hardened, things crystallized, things became ritualized. So I'm asking then, you guys, what happened? I mean, we're talking now about this kind of release from this, and we're talking about women being empowered in film and being empowered also in the film industry, not just on the roles on the screen, but making the movies too. But how did we get to this place where that needed to happen? What happened after the 1920s and 30s? Do you guys have any ideas?
Well, go ahead.
I guess it's funny. I was just thinking, like, well, in the early 30s, the Hays Code was introduced to, really limit what moral lessons and, more examples movies were setting. And it was funny because up to that point, a lot of movies were just like very kind of racy, and you went to the movies to see people kind of acting badly and getting away with that, right? Like people the appeal was to see people getting away with things that you would not be able to even imagine yourself getting away with in real life. And then at some point there was some kind of emerging sense from a certain kind of, moral, ethical, religious perspective that this was bad for society, that this was bad for people, setting all the wrong examples, and you need to clean up Hollywood. And, if somebody commits a crime, if somebody commits a murder, by the end of the movie, they have to be arrested. Like that justice has to be served. Nobody can get away with murder. There was some. So it would be interesting to know just sort of psychologically and culturally, what was going on, particularly, in the United States, where there was that emergent sense that, there's sort of some kind of psychological awareness that what the stories that people are telling are influencing people, and then again assumptions too that to depict bad behavior is to promote bad behavior. I think in terms of movies being, I could be totally wrong, but in terms of movies being used as, political, having, sort of like some awareness of their kind of propaganda potential. I mean, World War II, of course, there's very much a sense that it's like, okay, in terms of, the movies that we make, we can have people be, get on board with the war and eager to serve.
And they were good movies too. Some of them. I mean, people still talk about that wonderful World War II patriotic film where the Americans beat the Japanese or whatever, and they talk about it being a really good movie, so that it's not just like propaganda equals crap, but you have to go see it. It's actually there was an art to it.
Yeah.
And Wendy kind of hits on a really good point there, is that I do think World War II is exactly where it started to begin, because they saw the potential of how they could use films for propaganda in the 30s and 20s. Like Wendy's right, like it was more about just seeing people do crazy things. In the early 1900s, films were only part of the circus. You'd go to the circus and you'd go to this other tent that's next to the circus and see a moving picture because it was so revolutionary. So yeah, I definitely agree. I think that World War II point, things started to change after that.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me because we're talking about not just changes in film. We're talking about changes in culture. We're talking about changes in society as they are reflected in film. Mike, you said something really interesting in your opening answer to the question, what on earth is going on? You said, are things going to get worse?
Yeah.
You were saying, well, things are going to get better. Are we going to have more women directing more films and writing and taking starring roles and being the protagonist and not just the co-star? But then you said, are things going to get worse? What did you mean by that?
Well, this might be a slightly controversial take, because everyone, certainly in my life where I've had these conversations with, generally doesn't go well. So I will do my best to express myself the best way I can. What I mean by that is I think we've seen examples in history of our culture overcorrecting and then stepping backwards.
Yep.
Where I don't know that much about American politics, only a little bit, but I will say I believe that there was an overcorrection during a certain time period where the previous president was in, and now we've backtracked because of that overcorrection, because of oversights. So I think that every good movement and every good thing in life can go a very, very positive way or a very negative way, depending upon how people take it. And to me, it all goes back to original intention. The original intention of the Me Too movement was not only extremely powerful, but so important to get rid of monstrous people who were using their power to corrupt others. It wasn't just about the sexual harassment. That was the tool. But it was about Harvey Weinstein and other people, there's many others, who were using positions of power to intimidate and to scare and to harm other people. And I say people because it wasn't just women. It was all across the spectrum of gender and all across the spectrum of identity. People were feeling uncomfortable and feeling threatened and feeling like they had to do things in order to protect themselves. So I think that the Me Too movement, to a point, started to do these really powerful things where everything we've just talked about, more women I think will get film opportunities, which is great. I agree with Wendy, like I'm always get scared and nervous around tokenism, but I don't think that will happen specifically with filmmakers, because there's such a wide spectrum of filmmakers out there and such a wide spectrum of types of films that I think there's room for everybody. But where you can go wrong is the way the public and the general, I'm not too worried about the film industry. I'm worried about Mike and Ben and Wendy and individuals, because that's where the negativity around this movement is coming from. So if you spend any time looking at YouTube and reading YouTube comments and going on Twitter and reading Twitter comments, you will see that there are a lot of people who still have learned nothing from all of this. The Me Too movement is still criticized as people just trying to hurt powerful people. They're still not being taken seriously. After this whole movement was about listening and just taking a moment to listen and to have people be heard. Because the problem in the film industry was, at different moments, people who felt they were being abused or sexually harassed went to the HR departments of the Weinstein Company, of Rat Pack, which is Brett Ratner's company, and made complaints. And the responses from men, from women, from everybody was, well, that's just Harvey. That's just how they are. You kind of just have to get over it. We have to protect our asset, which I think is a major issue of not hearing and listening to someone who has a concern and someone who has a thought and someone who has really a feeling. I feel like this is happening to me, and no one was listening. And now we're at a point where the film industry is starting to listen by firing people, by trying to change, which is good. But when people try to change and are then continuously criticized by the general public, then you're never going to see change. Nobody, for a time period, nobody could say anything. Anytime anybody brought up anything, even no matter who you were, if you brought up a point saying, oh, I really think this is a great movement, I respect it, a day later there was an accusation about them. And I'm not saying that's bad. I think that that's what needs to happen. We have to hear that. But the general public now goes one of two ways. Either, no, I'm not going to listen to you whatsoever. You're just trying to hurt somebody else. Or, yep, this person did it. I don't need to see evidence. You should be fired from your job. Mm-hmm. And that is a dangerous track to be going down, where Twitter and YouTube and social media platforms give us the ability to villainize everyone before hearing evidence. I only can go off of what the media tells me. I can only go off of what I read. And if all you read is Twitter and YouTube comments by Mike in Kingston. Well, what does Mike in Kingston know about anything that's going on here? Really, I don't. I'm reading stuff on the New York Times or the Chicago Tribune or the London Times, or I'm on YouTube and Twitter. But for people who aren't connected to media, all they're seeing is each other's comments, and it creates a mob mentality. And I think that's the fear that I have, is where things can go. I'm going off on one of those rants we talked about. But the fear is that we are either villainizing people without evidence, or we're doing the opposite, which is what we've been doing before, which is the victim comes out and says something and we don't believe them. And both are wrong. So how do we find that middle ground? And I don't think the general public right now is good with middle ground. I think everyone is good with, you're evil, you're good, you're on this side, you're on this side, and that's it. And I think that that's dangerous and can make us regress to a worse place. I personally don't believe that the solution to the way that women or those part of the LGBT community, those part of who feel racialized, I don't think the solution is let's get rid of the white people. I think the solution is how can we all exist together? How can we coexist? How can we be together in this? And how can we make it so white guy Mike can make a film, but also a young woman can make a film, or a young person who's transgendered who has a story to tell? How can we all make films and all feel comfortable in that industry? So I think that that's kind of where my point was, is it could go down that route where everything's great and we work together, but because of the way we use social media, because of the instant access we have to people, I feel like it could go the opposite way so easily as well.
Yeah. It seems like you're talking a bit about just in general the kind of craziness of the kind of current culture war.
Yes, exactly. Yes,
what happens when you have a culture war, and that when when something erupts into a war where there's sort of this sort of fight where there's a sense there's going to be winners and losers, and either you're the sort of a with us or against us mentality, and certain sort of ideas or suggestions are either kind of you either have to accept them and support them unconditionally, or it's unthinkable and it's offensive. But that kind of with us or against us. Yeah. There's only winners and losers, winner take all, that just that kind of psychology. Absolutely. And then just the fear and paranoia and everything. There's something kind of scary.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be so like I mean, obviously the issues I'm bringing up are much more serious than say talking about film, but it's a good example of and again, I'm not going to name names, but there's lots of people I know that I can sit down and have a conversation with, and I might say, well, I really didn't like this movie and this is why, and they'll get upset. And passion is great. I respond to passion. I speak passionately. So when I'm talking about films, I speak in absolutes because it's my opinion. So it's my opinion. It's not wrong, but it's also not right. It's just an opinion. It's a thought. I have a thought on this film. And if someone else has an opposing view, I'm okay with that. But it seems like there is that culture created where, well, we disagree. That's not good. We have a problem now. We have to figure this out. And I still think it's the opposite. I find that I get along best with the people where I have opposing opinions with, because it's good to have that dynamic.
It is tricky that I think there is. I don't know. I'm trying to think. It's so hard to actually kind of gauge any kind of cultural change from your own kind of limited perspective as one person. But I mean, I think there is, feel like I have noticed a little bit maybe in the last few years that sometimes when it comes to say your taste in movies or your taste in culture, that it's not just a matter of you have your taste and you have the things that you like and you don't like, stuff you gravitate towards, resonates with you, you don't, that there can be more of a sense of if you're a good person or a right-thinking person, you will like this type of thing or support, or even sometimes you'll see people kind of supporting a particular type of movie sight unseen because it seems to kind of speak towards the kind of political and cultural ideals that they hold. And that if you don't like, that if you don't like something, you run the risk not just of having bad taste, but of being a bad person.
Yes,
so,
absolutely.
Yeah, I think when it comes to particularly to people expressing their kind of taste or opinion in movies and what they like or don't like, I think there might be a little bit more of a sense now in this current cultural moment that how does this make me seem as a person,
totally,
quote unquote good person, bad person, depending on who you're talking to.
And I think you bring up an interesting point about it's going beyond just my opinion now. It's the fear of how that will make me look, which I think that to me is symptomatic of the culture we live in of instant access. Because in my opinion, or at least my perspective, I don't think people have changed that much in this way. I think our ability to access each other has changed through social media is obvious. I'm a big fan of social media. I keep bringing it up, but I'm just trying to show that I don't think social media is evil. I think the way we use it is just incorrect. In the early I think it was 1990 when Michael Keaton was cast as Batman. Before Twitter, before YouTube, there was an outcry against it. What do you mean Beetlejuice is going to be Batman? Are you ridiculous? Like, everyone thought that was crazy. And Michael Keaton and Tim Burton were like, we don't care. We're making this movie. Nowadays, you have constantly actors leaving Twitter and leaving social platforms because of the harassment. Kelly Marie Tran, after the recent Star Wars movie, she played a kind of new character that was just in the Star Wars movie, had to leave Twitter because of, and I think, or Instagram, one of the two, because of harassment over people not liking the casting choice, the way the character is played, everything. And I mean, again, the same thing happened in 1990 and 2018. It's just, I think the reaction was different because Kelly Marie Tran's sitting at home and people, it's almost like people are knocking on your door. They're coming to you and there's instant access, and it's scary. It's not safe whatsoever. It would make me super nervous. So I think that, again, maybe people aren't changing, but we're adapting to these platforms and are now seeing ways to instant access each other, which again is just, a wild and awesome thing that we have, but we're using it in such a negative way that it's causing harm.
Yeah, it sounds to me like the dark side of democratization in film, right? So what a lot of people have argued, and they certainly argued this some years ago before we got to this zone of chaos that we seem to be in now, but that social media was a great democratic tool. So in the Arab Spring in 2011, people said, isn't it wonderful that Facebook and Twitter have allowed people in the Middle East to connect and rise up against their governments and throw off tyranny and despotic regimes? And only now do we recognize that, well, there was a dark side to that too, and look where it led. Yeah. And social media is also manipulatable. But when we talk about film and the industry of film, it's interesting because it seems like people now, through their social media and through mass conversation, have the power to fire actors, sink or propel a film to success. They have the power, we have the power, through our devices to shape the film industry.
Absolutely.
What we often don't recognize is that we are being shaped by our use of social media. There are people who argue that we are being every day engineered by algorithms to like certain things. And one of the things that I wanted to mention about this was that, Mike, you mentioned how you can have conversations with people now and you feel like they hate you as a person or take issue with you as a person because you don't like a film that they like. And there's two things I wanted to mention about that. First of all, I think partly what's happening is that we lose nuance when our conversation is in a YouTube comment section. There's no way on earth, I don't think, if one of us said something controversial, that we would then want to leave the room. I mean, it would have to be pretty bad for one of us to want to leave. Because if one of us said something really controversial and we would take issue with it, well, that doesn't reflect on the whole person. That's just one part of that person. That might be just an idea that they're throwing out. We can work with them and talk about it. There's nuance to a person. I am not one YouTube comment. I am a multiplicity of many things. And even if I'm not the sum of all of my YouTube comments either, which is a good thing because I'd be two, I think. Or even, I don't know, one.
When you're having a conversation, you're actually physically sitting across from someone. Like all of just human sort of psychology, mentality. It's all about so much of it is just about keeping the peace, keeping the harmony. You're so motivated to kind of make the conversation work or to make the interaction work or have things not end violently or in conflict. There's sort of the psychological forces to kind of make any in-person interaction kind of basically kind of harmonious. It's extremely powerful, and that just flies out the window online.
And not only are you not the sum of your one YouTube comment, I think what's also important that we forget is you're not the sum as something Ben said 5 years ago and something that Ben thought 5 years ago. You're the sum of experiences over a long period of time that make you who you are now. And too often now are we seeing examples of people bringing up nuances of, you said this 5 years ago, so therefore, like you're talking about the power that we have. All three of us in this room have the power to get someone fired from their job. That's how powerful we are in this day and age. Now, it would take more people and a hashtag and some great things, but that those things, that's the power we now wield, and that is something that we're sort of losing the overall experience of individuals and people, and we're focusing on, you said this, you thought this is how you were, you therefore are this, as opposed to exactly what you're saying. And I think that's a great way to put it. If someone says something controversial in this conversation in this room, we discuss it. We'd have a conversation. And I do think it would take something worse than the YouTube comments that I've read to get me to leave a room. Yeah. But over a computer, it is very different.
Well, you're not going to mute me or block me, right? But there is, by the way, a Black Mirror episode where you can do that, where it foresees a future in which you can actually block and mute people and scrub them free of your life, so you can't actually hear what they're saying or see what they're doing. And it's freaky, but that's the application of what you can do on social media onto our reality here, because we like to be able to block people and mute people. It makes everything easier to understand in a cookie cutter sort of way. Yeah. My last question for us is based on all of this. And I'm really keen to understand, with all of these changes, the democratization of power in film, the change of women and people of color being put to the sidelines in film, but then kind of reemerging now, and the incredible dynamic and churn that we're going through in film as an art form and, again, as an industry. With all of that happening, are films getting better? Or are they getting worse? Or are they just the same and it's just more stuff over and over again?
I guess there's a lot. The thing is, there's so many films being made around the world. Mm-hmm. There's only so, at the end of the day, there's only so many films, that get a theatrical release in Canada. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then it's even a smaller percentage of films that will play at the multiplex that people hear about. Like I was talking to this older guy not that long ago, and he was complaining about the state of movies today. And he's like, oh, it's all just a bunch of crap and, superhero movies. And, what happened to he's like, remember Forrest Gump? He's like, that was a nice movie. Why aren't they making movies like Forrest Gump anymore? And Forrest Gump is a very nice movie. And I said, I was like, do you ever watch movies at the screening room, right? Like, in my movie theater, we do play movies that tend to be about, real people, kind of adults, living their lives, sort of real human drama, human comedy. It's a different type of storytelling that really is in more alignment with the types of more kind of, we'll say human-based movies that, people were making in the 90s and 80s and earlier, rather than a lot of, special effects sort of, saving the world type of narratives or, computer animated kids films that you see at the multiplex. And he was like, I don't know. Here's the conversation. He's ultimately not that interested in going to the screening room, which is okay. I can totally respect that. But yeah, it's easy to just sort of look at what might be playing at the multiplex and think, Hollywood sucks, movies suck. But there's just so much out there. So if you're willing to kind of dig a bit deeper and look around, there are people too. Sometimes there will be, every so often I'll meet someone who really was not really much of a movie watcher. And then maybe they'll have a really good movie going experience, and then they'll develop this sort of movie going habit. And often too, a lot of time once people have kids and their kids grow up and they become empty nesters, they'll kind of fall in love with movies either for the first or second time in their lives. If you kind of dig around and look and kind of develop a sense of what your taste is, I mean, there really is something being made for everyone right now in every sensibility. It's just a matter of knowing where to look. And then that's one thing where, of course, like the internet and social media, it does can do a good job of promoting smaller things. Like this past summer, we've had a number of hit documentaries, like 3 Identical Strangers has been a huge hit, summer of 2018. It's one of the biggest movies we've played. We've been playing it. Right now it's going to be going into its 8th week of playing at the screening room, so 2 months. And it's, it's a documentary about 3, identical triplets separated at birth. And this movie, people come and watch it on a Saturday night at 7:00. It's a huge hit. And there was the Mr. Rogers documentary, Won't You Be My Neighbor, the Ruth Bader Ginsburg film. And it's just interesting to see documentaries become something that become the movies that people are like, this is the movie I need to see this week. This is the movie that people are talking about. And the internet, I think, has played a very positive role in giving them that sense of kind of vitality. You've got to see this energy. And, back when, before the internet, when everything was about, kind of television and newspaper marketing, that just simply didn't happen with documentaries.
Mike, and see if you can find a way for your answer to incorporate a plug for your new show.
Sure. Well, I think that, I mean, I think there's access to more films now. I don't want to say there's more movies being made now than ever. There might be, but there's always been a lot of movies made. Just like Wendy said, they don't always come to a theater near you. Sometimes they get lost. Whatever. Like Forrest Gump's a great example. The year that came out, I bet you if you looked at the movies out there, you probably haven't heard of like 90% of the movies because Forrest Gump was a hit. Which, by the way, I shamefully watched for the first time recently, and it was good.
Did you cry?
No, but I also I personally, this is like going off on a different tangent. I don't really get emotionally connected to movies in that way. I appreciate it for what it is, but I know it's not real, so I can't cry at a movie. It can't happen. And
not even the feather in the book.
Not even
around?
The feather in the book.
Oh,
no. I thought it was touching. I thought it was a touching movie, and I really liked the relationship and the parallels, especially the way it ended with. Spoiler alert, you should have seen it by now, but with his sort of family and how it continues, it was touching, but no, I didn't cry. But again, that's just because if I saw that in real life, I probably would. I'm very disconnected from what's on screen, but still in a very, I can get pulled in, love Simon. Love that movie that came out about a year ago. It was a fantastic movie. Really thought, it impacted me. But I didn't cry, and I was like, oh, I really enjoyed this. This was an awesome movie. But I didn't get emotionally kind of drawn in. I think that films are not necessarily better or worse. I think as I said, there's just more access to them. So you're going to see films that aren't as good as others. I still will argue, people can't see, but I'm wearing a Captain America shirt. I will still argue that the acting performance that Robert Downey Jr. did in Captain America Civil War was one of the best acting performances of that year. I have broken that down for people scene for scene, pausing it and showing his facial expressions because as someone who did study theater, I appreciate the nuanced acting that was there. And yeah, it's hilarious to think, but I honestly thought it was one of the best performances that I had seen that year.
Wendy, are you thinking you want to mute him right now?
Oh, no. It's funny. I don't, I really liked Captain America Civil War. It was a memorable experience. I went to the theater by myself to watch it. I think it was like a holiday Monday, and I came out of it pumping my fists, and I was like, I got to watch more of these Marvel movies.
For all the Marvel movies, I always go with a big group on opening, and then about a week or two later, I go by myself. Equally great experiences. But I think also, in terms of film, I think there's such a variety. Like Wendy, I think, said it perfectly, and I don't think there's more to say on it, that there's something out there for everybody. There are films that if you don't like superhero movies, there's lots for you. And there's always been this sort of anti-superhero movement that comes up every time there's a lot of superhero movies. Where people are like, well, I don't like superhero movies. All movies are superhero. There's lots that are not. Sorry to Bother You is a movie I saw this year at the screening room that just blew me away. I thought it was incredible. I thought it was such an amazing movie, and I like it on a different level. I can go and enjoy Mamma Mia and Mamma Mia 2 in a very different way that I can go and enjoy Moonlight or Sorry to Bother You or Love, Simon. It's a different type of enjoyment, but I can still enjoy both of them. And then to plug what I'm doing, I'm doing a movie show, talk and review show on CFRC that's on every Tuesday from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. And all of that is talking about movies coming to the screening room. A lot of movies people won't have heard of before come to the screening room. We're going to review them. We're going to talk about them. But the whole point of that is every movie I go to see when reviewing it, I want it to be the best possible version of that movie possible. I want Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles to be the best Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie directed by Michael Bay that I could ever see. I know what that could be, though. I know where the limitation might be, but I want it to be the best it can be. And that goes for the same as any obscure indie film that's going for its Oscar release and only has money to release in those few film theaters to try to get as much buzz possible to get an Oscar nom to make their money later. I want them both to be equally successful, just in different ways. And kind of the approach that I take to films is I'm a super fan who loves all type of films, but I'll give an honest opinion. And if I don't like a movie and you do, that's okay. I want it to be interactive. Tell me. We're going to have social media. Tweet at me. Tell me you don't like it, and let's come on the show and talk about it. That's the idea, is you want to be able to express yourselves, not limit it to, this is my feeling on it, now let's never speak again, and I now judge you based upon how you feel on something. Let's discuss it.
Or not feel, you heartless bastard.
Yeah, exactly. I'm so heartless, I never cry in movies. And I think that, talking about films in this way is so important, because that's, to me at least, that's what art comes down to. It's the interaction between the filmmaker and the expressor and the person listening, the audience member, and that interaction is where art actually happens.
Yeah, the idea that the show begins when the curtain has gone down and the lights have gone up and people start to talk. Yeah. That's when it truly begins. Wendy, final thoughts? Final
thoughts. Well, I'm looking forward to being a guest on Mike's new show and hearing what kind of conversations he has, the different reoccurring guests, and see what other people in Kingston think about the movies. Because we play a range of things at the screening room, and often the fleeting, I get to have fleeting conversations with people often as, they're leaving the theater asking, what did you think of it? And I'm interested in hearing people really sink their teeth into it and kind of discuss things with a bit more detail. I think right now is a really exciting time for movies, particularly as the weather gets cooler and we enter into the fall and the winter. A lot of the year's best movies do come out at around this time of year. I can say at the screening room, our busy period is very much from like Boxing Day up until the end of March. Of course, there's also 2 film festivals to look forward to, Reel Out and the Kingston Canadian Film Festival. So now is the time to start reading a bit more about movies, thinking about movies, developing a bit of a movie-going habit, listening to radio programs and podcasts about movies. I'm biased, but I'm pretty bullish on cinema right now. One thing I'll just say is I was talking to someone who was a second-year Queen's student, and she was saying that, she wasn't a big movie buff until just the past year or two, and that's because she was getting a little tired of, binge-watching television and binge-watching Netflix. She was like, oh, it's just such a waste of time. And she's like, the thing is, when you go into the movie theater, you shut off your phone, you just spend 2 hours watching this film, you get a good story, and then you're done, and then you can get on with your life. And I just thought, I was like, that's perfect. That's like the perfect testimonial for going to the cinema. And I think just sort of like the value of movies. Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. Guys, thank you so much for doing this.
Oh, thank you for having us.
All right. That's the conversation this week. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Special thanks, of course, to Mike Sheppard and Wendy Huot for joining me. Now, before we get to the quote of the week, I wanted to ask for your advice. When I'm planning episodes of this show, I'm usually thinking, who can I talk to about a really interesting subject matter? But I'm also thinking, what book might I read? A book that is addressing what on earth is going on. But sometimes there are stories out there, stories in the form of a poem or a short story or a novel, sometimes in the form of a television show or a movie. I've referenced many times on this show now the show Black Mirror, which I think is making a very clear statement on what on earth is going on and what on earth could happen in our world. It's something that I'd love to talk about. Maybe it'll be a series about Black Mirror, but I wanted to get your advice and see if you think that that's in the spirit of the show, if you think that that's something that would be worthy of exploring. Anyways, as usual, please go to the website www.wogoshow.com, WOEGO show.com. Find my email address or reach out to me on social media and let me know what you think of this idea. So, without further ado, here's your quote of the week. It is from the famous American director Martin Scorsese. Quote, "Cinema is a matter of what's in the frame and what's out of frame." Thanks for listening. Hey, just a quick note to let you know that this show was originally broadcast on CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, Ontario, Canada, and that you can also catch it every Tuesday on CHMR in St. John's, Newfoundland. Thanks again.